On the 5th of August, 2026, a tanker docked at a Russian port carrying gasoline. That happens every day in Russia. Russia is the second largest crude oil producer on the planet. It sits on top of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. It exports energy to dozens of countries across 4 continents. A tanker docking with gasoline should be the least interesting thing that happens in Russia on any given Tuesday. Except this tanker had not come from a Russian refinery. It had not come from Belarus or Kazakhstan or any country you might expect to be fueling Russia in wartime. It had come from India, specifically from a refinery on India's western coastline called Vadinar, in the state of Gujarat, roughly 7,000 kilometers from Russian territory, routed deliberately through a shadow fleet transfer off the coast of Egypt to obscure the trail before the fuel finally arrived at a Russian port. And this was not a one-off emergency shipment. This was Russia importing motor fuel from a country that has been buying its crude oil at a discount for years, refining that same crude, and selling the finished product back to the country that originally pumped it out of the ground, because Russia can no longer refine enough of its own oil to keep its own people's gas tanks filled. Stay with me, because by the time I walk you through how Ukraine turned the world's largest country by territory into a nation rationing fuel like it's 1991, what happened to the Moscow refinery 15 kilometers from the Kremlin that will not restart until at least 2027, why Putin was forced to publicly admit a crisis his government spent months pretending didn't exist, and what the tanker called Cyclone, sailing from India through Egypt to Russia, actually tells you about where this war stands right now, you are going to understand why this story matters far more than any single battlefield headline. Let's start with the scale of what has happened, because the numbers are the only way to understand the weight of this. Russia has roughly 38 large-scale oil refineries, not 38 plants with vague connections to fuel production. 38 dedicated industrial complexes designed specifically to take crude oil out of the ground and transform it into the gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, and heating oil that the Russian economy, the Russian military, and 140 million Russian people depend on to function. As of early July 2026, Ukraine's general staff announced that strikes had disabled 42, 7% of Russia's total projected oil refining capacity, not damaged it slightly, not temporarily disrupted some operations, disabled, as in offline, as in not refining crude, as in contributing nothing to the domestic fuel supply for weeks or months at a stretch. Over 60 storage reservoirs containing petroleum products and crude oil had been destroyed or critically damaged, and the total financial losses to Russia's refining industry since August 2025, when the campaign began in earnest, had been estimated at $13.5 billion. That is not a military statistic. That is an economic catastrophe. And it was built not by a single dramatic strike, but by a systematic, patient, relentless campaign that Russia's own state media was still describing as minor and manageable, even as its citizens lined up at gas stations for hours to buy fuel. The campaign did not begin overnight. It began building in the second half of 2025 with an escalating series of drone strikes on refineries across western Russia, the kind of targets that had occasionally been hit before, but never with the consistency, the volume, or the reach that Ukraine was now demonstrating. In August of 2025 alone, 14 separate refineries were struck, 8 more in September, 12 more in October. The International Energy Agency, an organization not known for dramatic language, stated in its monthly oil market report that the campaign had cut Russia's crude processing by an estimated 500,000 barrels per day, and that the impact would suppress Russia's refinery processing rates until at least mid-2026. That assessment turned out to be conservative. By the spring of 2026, the strikes had not slowed. They had accelerated. In May 2026 alone, 16 refineries were hit. At least 11 more were struck in June. And the geography of the strikes kept widening, reaching further into Russian territory with every passing month, hitting facilities that Russian planners had placed deep in the interior precisely because they assumed that distance would protect them. Then came the strike that changed everything about how people inside Russia understood the vulnerability of this campaign. On June 16th and June 18th, 2026, Ukrainian drones struck the Kapotnya oil refinery in Moscow's southeastern Kapotnya district. Let me be specific about what that means, because the location is the entire story. The Kapotnya refinery sits 15 kilometers from the Kremlin. 15. In a country where the official line for 4 years has been that this war is happening far away on someone else's territory, to someone else's people, Ukrainian drones flew directly over the Russian capital and set fire to the refinery that supplies 40% of the Moscow region's gasoline, 50% of its diesel, and a substantial share of the aviation fuel used at the capital's airports. The first strike, on June 16th, knocked out the refinery's primary crude processing unit, the ELOU AVT-6, which accounted for 53% of the plant's capacity, and halted operations. The second strike 2 days later came with nearly 200 drones targeting the southeastern outskirts of Moscow simultaneously, striking the refinery's second and final primary processing unit, along with pipelines, secondary installations, and storage facilities. Both processing units were disabled. The plant, which processes over 12 million tons of crude per year and is run by Gazprom Neft, was taken completely offline. Reuters reported, citing 2 industry sources, that the Moscow refinery was unlikely to resume production until at least 2027. The facility that provides nearly half of the Russian capital's fuel supply, sitting 15 kilometers from Putin's office, knocked offline for the better part of a year by drones that Ukraine built domestically and flew through what was supposed to be the most heavily defended airspace in Russia. And here is the detail that the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace noted in its analysis of the strike. The kind of detail that gets lost in the headline coverage, but explains everything about how this became possible. When the Kapotnya refinery was modernized in 2020, it replaced its multiple separate crude processing units with 2 large, integrated installations positioned very close to each other. In peacetime, this made complete engineering sense. Efficiency, simplicity, lower operating costs. It did not occur to anyone designing that modernization that doing so would create a situation where a second drone, strike 3 days after the first, could disable the entire plant's refining capacity in a single night, because back then no one was designing the refinery around the assumption that Ukrainian drones would one day fly over Moscow. Now they have, and that refinery will not run again in 2026. The consequences did not stay contained to Moscow. They spread across Russia with a speed and a geographic reach that the Kremlin's official communications clearly had not prepared for. As early as August 2025, Crimea and Russia's Far East were the first territories to report fuel shortages. By September, the Volga River region and southern and central Russia were all reporting supply problems at the retail level. By October, Forbes was reporting that the issues had spread rapidly across much of the country, with rising prices, rationing, and pumps running dry in specific locations. The Kremlin's response through the autumn of 2025 was to extend the export ban on gasoline that had been introduced as a temporary measure. Repeatedly, month after month, each extension an implicit admission that the domestic supply could not handle both civilian demand and export commitments at the same time. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, who oversees Russia's fuel sector, stood in front of cameras and declared that the domestic market was fully supplied. His own government simultaneously kept renewing the export ban that only makes economic sense if the domestic market is not, in fact, fully supplied. Then 2026 arrived, and the campaign intensified. In the first 6 months of the year, Ukrainian forces struck more than 20 separate refineries, hitting several of them multiple times before the previous damage had been repaired. The Moscow and Yaroslavl refineries were both struck repeatedly. By late June, Reuters was estimating that Ukraine's attacks had disrupted at least 17% of Russia's total oil refining capacity, and separately that Russia's overall fuel production had fallen by roughly 25% compared to the same month the previous year, with current domestic output running approximately 20% below what the Russian market actually needed, 20% below domestic demand. In a country with 140 million people, during summer, during the agricultural harvest season, during peak driving season, that gap does not disappear quietly. It shows up in lines at gas stations. It shows up in fuel purchase limits posted on signs at the pump. It shows up in regional governors issuing statements asking citizens not to panic while simultaneously calling emergency meetings about supply. By the middle of 2026, the crisis had formally broken through the surface of official Russian life in ways that were impossible to dismiss. Russian-controlled Crimea declared a formal state of emergency over fuel supply and banned gasoline sales to ordinary civilians altogether in June, the most acute visible manifestation of the shortage anywhere in Russian-held territory. 16 Russian regions had introduced restrictions on fuel sales by June 23rd. At least 6 regions rolled out an odd, even license plate rationing scheme, where drivers with plates ending in an odd number could only buy fuel on odd-numbered days and even plates on even days, an emergency measure Russia had not needed for anything since the Soviet era. By early July, most of Russia's 83 regions were experiencing some form of fuel restrictions, with the crisis directly affecting an estimated 50 million people, approximately 35% of the entire Russian population. Independent Russian outlet Novaya Gazeta Europe counted that shortages had been reported in at least 78 of those 83 regions. In the Siberian city of Irkutsk, officials installed portable toilets near gas stations to accommodate the motorists waiting in line for hours to refuel. 3 Russian regions, Penza Oblast, Irkutsk Oblast, and Zabaykalsky Krai, formally declared states of emergency over fuel supply. Long lines at gas stations, Once a symbol Russia's state media used to distinguish the misery of the Soviet past from the prosperity of the Putin era, were back. And they were in Moscow. There's a specific moment from the summer of 2026 that deserves its own paragraph, because it captures the political weight of this crisis better than any statistic. Putin was traveling to Novosibirsk. His motorcade passed near a gas station. The station was empty. His price board was turned off. Children were waiting nearby to see the president, and Putin stopped and spoke with them while the Kremlin's court journalist Pavel Zarubin filmed the exchange. That footage circulated immediately. A gas station with a blank price board in the background of a presidential visit. In any other political context, in any other country, a moment like that is handled carefully, staged away from any visible evidence of scarcity. In Russia, in July 2026, Putin's team apparently could not find a route through Novosibirsk that avoided an empty gas station long enough for a presidential photo opportunity. Putin had already made his first public acknowledgement of the crisis the week before. Not in a national address, not in a formal statement from the Kremlin. In a carefully staged interview with Pavel Zarubin, his personal Kremlin journalist, reading from a teleprompter, he said that Ukrainian strikes were causing gasoline shortages. He described them as, in his words, not critical. He said the situation was temporary. Then he pivoted immediately to demanding faster production of air defense systems. The format, the language, the teleprompter, the loyal interviewer, every element of that acknowledgement was designed to project control while admitting just enough to avoid appearing completely disconnected from a reality that 78 of his country's regions were now living inside. Analysis published at the time noted the significance of the format itself. Kremlin managers apparently decided that Putin risked looking too detached from reality if he continued to say nothing. That calculation, that staying silent is now more politically damaging than admitting the crisis exists, tells you how far the situation has traveled from the official story of a war that costs ordinary Russians nothing. Now let's talk about what Russia did to try to close the gap, because the response tells you as much about the severity of the crisis as the crisis itself. Export bans. Russia banned gasoline exports entirely. It then banned diesel exports by non-producer companies. It then extended both bans. It signed a decree lowering the quality standard for domestic gasoline production from Euro 5 down to Euro 3, essentially authorizing refineries to produce lower-grade fuel than peacetime standards would allow, because producing any fuel was more important than producing the right kind of fuel. It prioritized government vehicles at gas stations. It imposed purchase limits across regions. It opened negotiations with Kazakhstan and Belarus for additional fuel imports by land, both of which were providing some supply but not enough to close the gap. And then, in the last resort move that no one in the Russian energy establishment wanted to acknowledge, it started importing gasoline by sea from India. This is where the tanker Cyclone enters the story, and the route it took deserves your full attention, because the logistics of this shipment are themselves a confession. On June 18th, the same day Ukrainian drones were setting the Kapotnya refinery ablaze over southern Moscow, the Russian-flagged tanker Cyclone, formerly known as Agni, was loading 42,000 metric tons of gasoline at the Vadnar refinery on India's western coast. The gasoline was produced by Naira Energy, an Indian refiner with a 400,000 barrel per day processing capacity at Vadnar, backed by Rosneft, Russia's own state-controlled oil giant, which holds a 13% stake in the company. So the crude oil Russia sells to India at a discount travels to India. An Indian refinery majority owned by a Russian state company refines it into gasoline. The gasoline is then loaded onto a Russian-flagged tanker and shipped back toward Russia. But it does not go directly. Instead, the tanker sails to Damietta, Egypt, on the Mediterranean coast, where the gasoline is transferred to a second vessel, the Oman-flagged Garnet, in a ship-to-ship transfer, specifically used, according to analysts at Kapler, to reduce exposure to sanctions-related scrutiny. The Garnet then completes the journey to Russia, arriving August 5th. Bloomberg confirmed the arrival. Kapler analytics firm confirmed it. Multiple product tanker tracking operations confirmed it. Russia could not deny it. And Sumit Ritolia, the lead analyst at Kapler, described the appearance of Indian gasoline in Russia's supply chain in language that tells you exactly what the market thinks it means. He called it particularly notable and said it underlines the severity of the current domestic gasoline imbalance. Think about the economics of what just happened. Russia extracts crude oil from the ground. It sells that crude to India at a discount because Russia needs buyers and Western sanctions have reduced its options. India takes Russia's discounted crude, refines it, and sells the finished product back to Russia at market prices. Russia then pays shipping costs across thousands of kilometers, plus the cost of a shadow fleet transfer operation off the coast of Egypt, plus whatever premium the complexity of that route adds to the final price, to receive fuel that started as its own resource. Ukrainska Pravda's analysis of this situation was direct. Importing petroleum products from India that are refined from Russian crude makes little economic sense. It doesn't. From a pure financial logic standpoint, this is a deeply irrational transaction. And Russia is doing it anyway, because the alternative is not irrational economics. The alternative is gas stations running dry. There is another layer to this story that the route through Egypt illuminates specifically. Naira Energy was sanctioned by the European Union in July 2025, a year before this shipment took place, because of its ownership connection to Rosneft and its role in processing Russian crude. Since those sanctions, Naira has been relying on shadow fleet tankers and transshipment operations to receive incoming crude and export outgoing fuels, because legitimate Western-compliant shipping companies will not handle its cargo. The ship-to-ship transfer at Damietta is not a quirk of logistics. It is a sanctions evasion mechanism that has become standard operating procedure for Russian energy supply chains operating under Western restrictions. And even with all of that complexity, with the discounted crude, the Indian refining margin, the shadow fleet tanker, the Egyptian transfer, the Omani-flagged receiving vessel, the final delivery cost, Russia still needed to do it, because the alternative was emptier gas stations than the ones already being photographed in Putin's motorcade. And there was more gasoline coming. Another product tanker, the Varg, loaded nearly 40,000 tons at Vadinar on July the 6th, and was tracked conducting a similar ship-to-ship transfer in late July, according to Kapler. Reuters had reported in late June that Russia was planning to import approximately 400,000 tons of gasoline per month from various countries to try to offset the domestic shortfall. For context, Russian summer gasoline consumption runs at a minimum of around 110,000 tons per day. Even 400,000 tons per month from all sources combined, if Russia could actually secure it, would cover less than 4 days of national daily consumption. The import plan is not a solution to the crisis. It is a pressure valve designed to prevent the most acute, visible symptoms from becoming politically unmanageable while the Kremlin figures out what comes next. Let's be clear-eyed about what the strikes have and have not accomplished, because honest analysis requires naming both. Russia's refining sector is operating at its weakest level in more than 2 decades, with crude processing volumes falling to a 24-year low. Ukraine's own general staff assessed that strikes had disabled 42, 7% of total projected refining capacity. The financial losses are estimated at $13.5 billion since August 2025. Gasoline production is running approximately 25% below year-on-year levels. 78 of 83 Russian regions have reported fuel shortages. Crimea declared a fuel state of emergency. 3 Russian regions declared formal states of emergency. Putin admitted to the crisis on camera. Russia banned fuel exports, then extended the ban. Russia started importing gasoline from India by a shadow fleet route through Egypt. All of that is confirmed, documented, and verified by multiple independent sources, including Bloomberg, Reuters, Kapler, the International Energy Agency, and Russia's own regional officials. That is a real, serious, compounding crisis. But Russia has not run out of fuel, and it would be dishonest to say otherwise. The system, while badly damaged, has not collapsed. Russia's 36 refineries, even with more than a third of projected capacity disabled, are still producing fuel. Import routes from Belarus, Kazakhstan, and now India are providing some additional supply. State subsidies have kept prices from fully reflecting the shortage at the retail level, at enormous fiscal cost that is itself compounding Russia's budget problems, but preventing the kind of immediate price shock that might trigger more acute public anger. Russia's Q1 2026 budget deficit had already reached 58 trillion rubles by the time the refinery strikes intensified, already exceeding the government's own full-year target of 79 trillion rubles. The subsidy cost alone in 2025 was approximately 6 trillion rubles, roughly half the federal budget deficit for that year. With production running 25% below year-on-year levels and wholesale prices 80 to 90% above the official benchmark, the 2026 subsidy burden will be substantially higher. That is money Russia is spending not on weapons, not on soldiers, not on the war, but on keeping the domestic fuel price from visibly exploding at the pump. And there is a repair problem that goes beyond financing. Ukraine's general staff noted that the drastic reduction in refining capacity has resulted in continuous delays in facility repairs due to a lack of available replacement parts and equipment under international sanctions. A catalytic cracking unit, the kind of equipment that converts crude into gasoline, is not assembled from components available at an industrial supply warehouse. It requires specialized parts, many of them historically sourced from Western manufacturers who are now sanctioned from supplying Russia. Every refinery that Ukraine hits has to be rebuilt using components Russia can no longer simply order from the suppliers that built the original equipment. That makes each repair slower, more expensive, and less certain to fully restore original capacity. The Moscow refinery's modernization in 2020 made it more efficient in peacetime and more catastrophically vulnerable in wartime. The parts needed to rebuild it are subject to the same sanctions that are already stretching every other repair timeline in the Russian defense industrial sector. The strike on Moscow matters symbolically in a way that the refinery hits in Saratov, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and the Russian Far East do not, because the Russian state's central propaganda claim for 4 years has been that ordinary Russians are insulated from this war, that the fighting is happening somewhere else, to people who are not like them, in a conflict that does not reach the streets of Moscow or fill their news feeds with anything personally threatening. On June 18, 2026, Moscow residents filmed black smoke rising over the southern skyline. Multiple neighborhoods reported what was described as black rain, oil particles in the air above residential areas. Major roads were temporarily closed. Airports briefly halted incoming flights. And the largest fuel supplier to the Moscow region, the refinery 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, went offline for the rest of the year. The people who live in Moscow did not need a state media bulletin to understand that something had reached them that was not supposed to reach them. They could smell it. Now, zoom out to the full picture, because Moscow and Kapotnya are one data point in something much larger. Ukraine has struck every single one of Russia's 10 largest oil refineries at least once in 2026. Every single one. Omsk, which was Russia's largest individual refinery by processing capacity, had been untouched for the first 2 years of the campaign. It fell on July 6th and 7th. That strike closed the list. The last facility Russia could point to and say was safe by virtue of distance or geography or air defense coverage. Gone. And the Bashkortostan Gazprom Neftekhim Salavat complex, one of the major petrochemical plants Ukraine targeted, was described explicitly by Ukrainian sources as the last major Russian petroleum producer that had gone the entire year without being hit, and then it was hit. Every time, Russia drew a line around a facility and said, this one is too far, this one is too big, this one is too important, this one is protected. Ukraine went and struck it anyway. The same pattern that runs through every aspect of this war's deep strike campaign runs through the refinery campaign specifically. Russia builds a defensive assumption calibrated to the threat level it has already encountered. Ukraine builds a capability that exceeds the assumption before Russia has finished defending against the previous one. Russian electronic warfare systems were designed to jam drone command links and send the drone off course. Ukraine built drones with autonomous terminal guidance that do not need a live command link to complete an attack run. Russian air defense was concentrated around the capital and the front lines because those were the obvious targets. Ukraine reached Kapotnya, 15 kilometers from the Kremlin, with nearly 200 drones in a single night. Russian logistics planners scattered refineries across the country's vast interior because distance was supposed to provide protection. Ukraine's long-range drone fleet, including the FP-1 platform with effective ranges approaching 2,000 kilometers, reached Omsk, the Bashkortostan complex, facilities in Tatarstan, refineries in Russia's Far East that residents there had never, in living memory, had reason to consider vulnerable to anything. Russia closes yesterday's gap. Ukraine opens tomorrow's. What does all of this add up to, taken together as a single strategic picture? Russia, one of the world's largest oil producers, with the world's largest natural gas reserves, a country whose entire wartime budget depends on energy export revenue, is currently banning fuel exports it cannot spare, rationing the fuel it has left across 3/4 of its regions, importing motor gasoline from India through a shadow fleet route designed to evade sanctions, and watching its primary Moscow area refinery sit offline until some point in 2027 while it tries to source replacement parts it can no longer legally buy from the companies that built the original equipment. In the Kontimansi Autonomous Okrug, the region that produces roughly 40% of Russia's entire crude oil output, gas stations have been running short. Russia is pumping oil out of the ground in one part of the country and running dry at the gas station in the same part of the country. That is not a normal state of affairs for one of the world's largest energy producers. That is a supply chain that has been systematically dismantled from the refining layer outward. Putin is still claiming the shortages are temporary. He is still saying the war will continue. He is still insisting that Ukraine's attacks are nothing more than an attempt to distract attention from losses on the battlefield. But the tanker Cyclone sailed from Vadanar on June 18th, the same day his capital's refinery was burning. It transferred its cargo to the Omani-flagged Garnet at Damietta, Egypt, on July 6th. It arrived in Russia on August 5th. Kapler tracked it, Bloomberg reported it, and the arrival of Indian gasoline in a Russian port routed through a sanctions evasion transfer off Egypt's Mediterranean coast is not a story Russia's state media can tell its own way. The tracking data doesn't care about the official narrative. The tanker either arrived or it didn't. The gasoline either came from Vadanar or it didn't. Sumit Ratolia at Kapler called it particularly notable. That is analyst language for something has changed fundamentally here, and everyone in the industry knows it. Russia told its own people for 4 years that this war costs them nothing they can feel. The lines at gas stations from Krasnodar to Vladivostok, from Irkutsk to Crimea, from Moscow's southern suburbs to the Khanty-Mansi oil fields are the answer to that claim written across every blank price board at every empty pump in 78 of 83 Russian regions. The portable toilets Irkutsk installed near its gas stations so that motorists waiting hours to refuel had somewhere to go. The presidential motorcade that could not find a working gas station to drive past in Novosibirsk. The teleprompter Putin read from to deliver the first public acknowledgement that, yes, there are queues at petrol stations, and finding the right grade of petrol isn't always easy. The tanker that sailed 7,000 kilometers from western India through the Egyptian Mediterranean to deliver Russian crude, refined in a Rosneft-backed Indian plant, back to the country that originally pulled it out of the ground because that country can no longer turn its own crude into its own fuel at a sufficient rate to keep its own people's tanks filled. That tanker is not just a shipping story. It is a summary of what a sustained, systematic, patient strike campaign against industrial infrastructure does when it is carried out with enough consistency and enough reach over enough time. It does not win a war by itself. Russia is still fighting. Russian forces are still advancing in certain sectors. The war is not ended because Moscow's biggest refinery is offline until 2027. But it has become more expensive, more visible, more present in the daily lives of ordinary Russians, and far harder to explain away with the language of temporary, not critical, in being addressed. Every refinery that stays offline through the autumn harvest season is a logistics problem for the tractors and trucks that move Russian agricultural output. Every region rationing gasoline into the winter is a heating fuel story waiting to happen. Every additional month the Kapotnya plant stays dark is another month. Moscow depends on fuel routed from refineries that were never designed to supply the capital at this scale, through a distribution network not built for this load, under a wartime budget that is already running well past its own deficit targets. And every shipment of Indian gasoline that travels from Vadanar through Egypt to a Russian port tells a market that watches tanker movements in real time that the system which was supposed to make Russia self-sufficient in fuel, the system that Putin once described as proof that Western sanctions cannot touch the Russian economy where it lives, is no longer self-sufficient. It is rationing what it has. It is importing what it lacks. It is paying for the fuel it cannot produce from money it cannot afford to spend. From a budget already crumbling under the weight of a war, it told its own people would be brief, would be manageable, and it would cost them nothing they could feel at the pump. The price board at the empty gas station in Novosibirsk said everything. It was turned off because there was nothing honest left to display.